So now I want to talk a little bit about sort of the more the policy-related evaluation of interventions. And some of you may think this is a little bit nerdy. Nevertheless, okay, it's going to take like 20 seconds. That's what I'm going to talk about. And so I'm going to start out with you're all policymakers now, okay? So imagine you're a policymaker. You may be the head of the Y, or you may be in Stephen's role, or you may be allocating money for your school district, and you hear about these two programs. And I'm going to give you examples of programs that are about reducing the number of methamphetamine users. Okay, it could be opioid prescription users, very similar kind of outcome data. And getting there?
Getting there.
Okay, okay, good.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so I'm going to give you two interventions. I'm going to tell you about two interventions. And one intervention has an effect size. You know if everybody knows an effect size? It's sort of usually they go between 0 and 1. They can be more than 1 in treatments, but usually effect size is average in education, about 0.2 to 0.3 for reading, math intervention programs, that kind of stuff. Or you could reduce the number of methamphetamine users by 42%. Okay, you can have an effect size of 0.49, moderate effect size, or you could reduce the number of users by 42%. Which one would you choose? How many would choose an effect size of 0.49? Okay, how many would reduce the number of users by 42%? Okay, it's the exact same data. Okay, I'm giving you two ways to talk about the exact same data. And that's the problem we have from a policy standpoint. That's really clear. 42% people are no longer going to use. Wow, that's a public health reduction. And effect size, what does that mean? Okay, so I'm going to tell you about a trial I've been involved in for a long time. It's called the PROSPER trial. It's a large cluster randomized trial. 28 communities, 14 in Iowa, 14 in Pennsylvania, all sort of small communities, because Iowa has small communities, we match to them. And we're interested in teen substance use prevention. And in those 28 communities, we have middle schools, and we have 11,000 sixth graders, and we follow those 11,000 sixth graders till the end of high school. We assess them each year for their drug and alcohol use and other things. And we provided family interventions so half of those are intervention schools, and half of them are randomized comparison schools, 7 in each state. And in sixth grade, we offered them family programs. We offered them a menu of 3 family programs that each school could choose from. We would teach them how to implement it. We would hire facilitators. We would monitor implementation quality. They would learn how to do all these things. And we have local teams. Each middle school has a team. I won't get into the details. It's a long story. And then in 7th grade, we offered the school 3 drug abuse prevention programs. And they again could choose the one they wanted. We trained the teachers in doing it, and they implemented it. And we followed a number of cohorts of kids, and we followed them over time. So here's an example. This is the data on PROSPER on the methamphetamine outcomes, the number of new users in the intervention, the control condition. And you can see at the beginning, this is 6th grade, this is the end of 6th grade, 7th grade, middle 7th grade, 8th grade, et cetera. There's no effect. If we stopped the study in middle of 9th grade, we'd show that the intervention had no effect. Okay? But why? Because the developmental process has not kicked into place yet enough to see the big difference. Here, there's a very big effect. It's significant. In fact, it's 42% fewer kids are new users of methamphetamine by that point. So the first problem is longitudinal. We have to follow cases long enough to see them have the problem. Okay? Now, in the same data set, we already see alcohol different uses already here, but certain drugs are going to kick in at different times. So opioids and methamphetamine is what everybody's talking about these days, right? But you don't stop opioid addiction by starting when kids are 15 or 16, because there's a pathway they're going through, right, to get there. So now when they're in 11th grade, now we have 42% fewer users in the new users in the intervention schools compared to the comparison schools, matched on everything else. Okay, so this is using. Remember, I started my talk talking about bringing public health ideas into education and how to think about things. So here's the data. We got 3.7% of kids using methamphetamine by. This is 4.5 years. This is the end of 10th grade in the intervention communities. We got 6.4% in the control communities. Okay, so that's significantly different. That's a pretty good effect size. People like this effect size, but the relative risk, which is the reduction in the rate, is 42%. The absolute risk is a difference of 2%. We need, in epidemiology, we often use the number needed to treat. We need to treat 37 kids. 37 kids have to get the intervention to reduce one methamphetamine user. Okay? Most of you have never heard number needed to treat unless you're in the School of Population Health, but this is important. Ecstasy, same thing, same time. See, effect size is 6.65, but we have 44% fewer ecstasy users, and we need to treat 30. Drunkenness, right, which is how many kids are drunk, are reported they being drunk, is a difference of only 4%. But we have a big population. We're studying 11,000 kids. It's significant. It has an effect size of 0.49. And interesting, the same effect size as methamphetamine. But we only reduced the relative risk. We've only reduced drunkenness by 7.4%. Okay? So we got the same effect size. How can we get the same effect size, but an enormous difference in the relative risk? That's because effect size is related to normality. Okay? And so effect size is a really bad measure for something that doesn't occur very often. But the somethings that don't occur very often turn out to be very expensive. Okay? And this is a universal population. We treated everybody, right? We didn't treat kids that had drug problems. We didn't screen and do an intervention. Everybody in the school, all the kids got these programs, and if their parents came, the parents got the programs. And what you can see is effect size is a really bad indicator of a low rate problem, because we've reduced by 42% the number of users, same effect size, 7%. Okay? The more normal the thing is, the better effect size is. The less normal it is, the poorer it is at actually explaining to policymakers why this would be important. Okay, so why is it important? Well, it's important for a lot of reasons. One is that we don't have to screen kids for early meth use in order to prevent it, right? We can do universal intervention. Remember the paradox again? But the average cost to society of a meth user is pretty expensive. It's somewhere between around $33,000 for just the kids starting to use is the cost effect, but $74,000 for a kid to be an addict. And if an estimated number of to treat is 37, and the cost of Prosper costs about $800 per family, just reducing meth already pays for the whole cost of the program. Okay? Not thinking about alcohol, other illegal drug use, other costs, just the treatment for becoming a user already pays for the entire program. Okay? But an effect size of 0.49 doesn't sound like that, does it? So how we frame our data is really important. Okay? And this goes back again to Rose. When few individuals have a problem, large sample sizes are necessary to detect the change. If we didn't have enough kids, we wouldn't have enough users, and we wouldn't have been able to detect the change as substantial and significant. Standard effect sizes, which are what education uses now to rate programs, are base rate sensitive and thus may underrepresent the importance of change for low frequency outcomes. It's the same thing for educational outcomes, like kids that are really have math disabilities, for example. So relative risk and absolute risk may be better to represent the importance of the findings. So the classic study that showed all this is in healthcare. It's the aspirin study. You know why you go to the drugstore, you have that 10 milligram aspirin, and everybody is supposed to take it. This is due to the 1988 report of the Physicians' Health Study. It's a very famous study in which they took doctors. There were 11,000 doctors in each group, and half of them were given a daily aspirin, the low-dose aspirin, and half of them were given a placebo that looked exactly the same. Okay? So here's the results reported in 1988 on fatal and non-fatal heart attacks. In the intervention group, out of 11,000 people, there were 104 events, and in the placebo, got the sugar pill, there were 189 events. This is 0.9%, so less than 1%, and this is 1.7%. The effect size is 0.03. So small that if we were doing this in education, we'd say, let's never spend money on this again, okay? But it reduced the number of people that had a heart attack by 47%. In fact, the study was stopped by the government because they thought it was unfair not to have the aspirin for the control group. Okay? So let's be careful how we think about things. So the interesting thing is there was another report no one's read, except for me probably. In 1989, there was another report in the New England Journal of Medicine, one page, that said, in fact, the effects were not even main effects. The effect only happened in the doctors that were over age 50. And for people under age 50, it had no impact, right? Now let's go back to Prosper again. Here we have substance use initiation on marijuana use. And now we can divide kids into high-risk groups and low-risk groups. We can think about kids that were high risk, and we identified them before the study began when they were in 6th grade because they'd already had a drink of alcohol by their self-report. They were low SES in terms of their socioeconomic status. They had free and reduced lunch. I think we used single parenting and one other factor I don't remember. So we divided the kids into high risk and low risk, high risk and low risk, and intervention and control. Okay? So now what's the data tell us about marijuana use and the trajectories of a universal intervention? Well, you can see that in this is the low risk kids. There is a difference, and it's actually significant because we got 10,000 kids. We reduced marijuana use, especially starting in 9th and 10th grade, a little bit in the low risk group. But because most of the low risk kids aren't going to be using, right? You have to have a lot of sample in order to find a difference because there aren't that many users, maybe 20%, 15%. But in the high risk group, there's no effect here, but the effect begins and it sort of grows a little bit over time. So it's a pretty large effect. Now you may or may not care about marijuana as a variable. It's just an example. Some people would say that doesn't matter, although there's lots of good data that early use of marijuana, even though just like adults it may be fine, just like alcohol, early use seems to have big effects on brain organization. So it's like alcohol, starting early is bad. We know that every year we delay the start of alcohol, we reduce the number of adult alcoholics. And there's pretty good data, I think, that will soon develop that's the same thing with marijuana, that early starting use of marijuana, well, it's going to become normative by age 18 for 60-70% of kids probably to get high, and definitely by 21. It's the early use that is where potential damage occurs and where addiction is more likely to happen. Okay? So even if we all agree that alcohol and marijuana are maybe both okay things, or we don't agree, that it doesn't matter, the early use is still the biggest developmental issue. Okay, so what's the implications? The effect was preventive for both high-risk and low-risk kids, but to have a preventive effect, one must wait long enough for the control group to increase in the problem. Okay? This requires longitudinal data, and the analogy is polio. If we had only waited 6 months after we gave everybody the polio vaccine, we would have thought the vaccine did not work. Okay? So we've got to figure out what the developmental profile is of the control group, of normal development. And we've got to time things well so that we follow the intervention long enough to see its true effect. Or we'll say, like there's a lot of studies that say social emotional development, post-test, there's not much effect. So people say the program didn't work. Okay? Actually, it's not true. So universal interventions can also act not only on individuals, but they can act on networks. Because we're treating everybody, we can not only change individuals' outcomes, but we can change how social networks work. So in Prosper, we looked at social networks influences, and did kids who are in the intervention schools, did their networks change? Not did they just use less, but how did that process occur? So we can think about a black dot as a substance user here, and a white dot as a non-user. Okay? Here in this frame, the black dots are the kids in the center of the social network. That is, more kids are bidding to them and seeing them as friends, et cetera, and the kids who are not using are on the outside. In this picture, exactly the opposite is. Non-users become the center of the popular kids in the network, and the users become more peripheral. Okay? And that's what we found in Prosper. We had every child, all 11,000, tell us about their friends. We looked at their friends' drug use because every child in the school was reporting for these 11,000 kids, and we looked at did the networks change in the intervention schools compared to the comparison schools. It's the first study I know of that's shown a universal effect not only on individuals but on the structure of their networks. And what we found is that Prosper shifted the peer influence more towards non-users. Non-users became more popular, had more friends, and users had less. So when Rose talked about this, Jeffrey Rose talked about this, he talked about this as what he called a shift in the bell-shaped curve. That we're not just interested in risk reduction in this high-risk group, we're interested in shifting the whole population so that the population goes from this higher risk, and the whole population goes in a bell-shaped curve to lower risk. And that's one way to think about the population health effect. We're affecting everybody. We're lifting all boats. Okay? But it might not happen that way. Okay? It might happen in a different way than that, and now we have statistical models to do this, because that's the question of main effects in a way. Do we get a main effect? So if we look at the population and the intervention and the control across time, is the whole population significantly different? Is the mean and the standard deviation shifting? But for some interventions, the goal is to shift the mean and lift the whole population, but other universal interventions may only affect segments of the population or have a different effect on different parts of the population. This is complex, and we are just beginning to have statistical models that I think start to approximate the reality of this. Some cases we're not sure who will be impacted. A lot of times I didn't know who would be impacted. Would it be the highest risk kids, the lowest risk kids? So now we have a new world of what we call moderation, and in our work we're also doing gene effects. So for example, in Prosper, there are genes that we know are risky for alcohol use and addiction. And what we've shown, and I won't get into the data on this today, is that, kids that have the risky gene are more likely to be impacted by the intervention. So the kids that don't have the risky gene, there's not much effect. But it's the kids, among the kids that have the risk gene, that we see more difference between the intervention and control group. Okay, that's good. It's a good thing. That's moderation. So I'll just tell you quickly about a social emotional study. It's called the Head Start REDI study. It's done by my colleague Karen Bierman. And there's a number of trials, but this is one trial. 356 4-year-olds in 44 Head Start classrooms. So that means they're all low income. Some are urban and some are more rural. Classrooms were stratified on location and demography and length of day into either getting what we call the REDI model or not. Okay, and the REDI model combined the PAS curriculum. We have a preschool version for 3 and 4-year-olds, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, and language and emergent literacy skills. I won't get into the details, but for example, the books that were picked for language and literacy were picked because they linked to the social emotional program. So everything got more integrated, okay? And we follow the kids up, Karen followed the kids up, and teacher ratings of adjustment from kindergarten to 3rd grade, and now we're actually following them. They're actually in high school now, we're still following them, okay? So did REDI effects fade out? So for language and literacy, these are Head Start kids, 3, 4-year-olds. We looked at them in kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade. It looked like for language and literacy, the effects probably fade out. And part of the reason is they go to schools often because they're in poor neighborhoods that probably don't have as good a quality of instruction as they might, and the effects fade. For social emotional, the effects were sort of mixed at different grades. So we had main effects for social competence and aggression in grades kindergarten and 2nd, but not in 1st and 3rd. They were trending, but they weren't significant. So what does that mean? Well, we have different teachers rating kids each year. Are there teacher effects? It's all, of course, very complicated. But the means always favored the REDI group, even when they weren't significant. Okay? So if you conduct an intent to treat analysis, you include all the kids in the analysis in a randomized trial, and there's no significant main effect, or the effects are inconsistent, like they are in this case. Does that mean the intervention has failed? Okay? It's the problem of thinking that main effects are the way to answer the problem. Okay? And this is part of the adoption we've adopted of the medical model of randomized trials. And by that, I mean randomized trials are the only way to know if something works. I'm a randomized trial guy. But we assume that, in a randomized trial, like let's say we're taking a problem of back surgery. People have bad back problems. Half of them get randomized to a back surgery, half of them don't. And we ask the question, how many get better? Or we take people that are all clinically depressed and we give them mindfulness treatment and a cognitive behavioral treatment and pharmaceutical treatment, and we see which group is likely to improve more, okay? They all start out with a disease. They all have the problem, and now we're seeing how many don't have the problem later. But in a universal intervention, 90% of the kids don't have a problem, right? So a lot of the kids can't get better. So a main effect analysis is not very useful, because if most people can't get better, at least in the short run, then there's no way main effects will show us the effects, okay? So we use alternative models of doing this kind of work, and there's lots of them. The goal of many preschool interventions is to change children's developmental trajectory. Few evaluations actually look at each children's developmental trajectory, okay? Most examine just intervention control differences before and after the intervention, which focuses on the population, roses, two bell-shaped curves, the mean and the standard deviation. Is the mean and the standard deviation moving enough that there's a main effect? Okay? Yet trajectories of social emotional functioning can improve, get worse, or remain stable among different subgroups. Some kids may be getting worse in the intervention, some may be getting better, some may be staying the same, etc. So we don't expect uniform effects. No teachers think that the same thing they teach is that reading, math, social emotional development is going to change kids in the same ways because they have different starting points, they have different issues, etc. So we have to think about different ways of doing this. One is what's called latent growth trajectory analysis. So we did these latent growth trajectories. We used the teacher ratings from 5 time periods, pre-K, Head Start, K, 1 and 2. And we did latent, we identified what were called latent classes of children, subgroups of children that had distinct developmental trajectories. After we determined these trajectories for each child and then grouped them together in groups, then we examined their membership by intervention condition. Okay? And given a random assignment, we randomly assign these kids, membership in each trajectory should be equal across conditions. The same number of kids should be in each risk group when they're in, say, 3rd grade, by definition, unless there's a treatment effect. So here's the data, which is just published in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology. First off, there's Rob Nix. So here's for social competence. We found 3 trajectory groups. We found a group that is really low in social competence, right? Really low in social competence. And so the teachers rate them as really having poor peer relations, not getting along well, having poor emotion regulation skills. And what we see is there's 28% in the control condition, but only 18% in the intervention condition. Okay? Now think about my relative risk reduction. We've dramatically, almost in half, reduced the number of children with low social competence across the 5 years. Even though I told you the main effects were inconsistent, maybe the intervention worked, maybe it didn't. For these kids, it really worked. For the kids in the middle, it didn't seem to have much effect, right? About 50% of the kids didn't have much effect. And then for the kids that were high in social competence, it actually increased the number of kids that were very socially competent. So it's moving kids out of this group into this group, and some kids out of this group into this group. Okay? So we can do the same thing for aggressive behavior. So now we've got the highly aggressive kids everybody's interested in. Okay? There's almost no main effect on aggression in this study, but the relative risk reduction is we've reduced by 50% the number of highly aggressive kids. Okay? Now if you went to a superintendent and said, I can reduce the number of highly aggressive kids in your district between kindergarten and 3rd grade by 50%, by doing an intervention when the kids are 3 and 4 years of age, they'd think that's really a good intervention. If I said, well, there's a study in which we looked at aggression and overall there's a little bit of effect maybe over time, but not much, they wouldn't be interested in it, right? So we need to think really thoughtfully about a universal population. Most kids, right, these groups, don't have much problem, although it turns out there's a small effect here because the sample size is so large. Learning engagement, the same thing. Learning engagement improves. So these are kids that are really engaged in learning, and you can see that there are more kids that are now in the highly engaged learning condition. Right? They're more likely, teacher said, they're motivated, they're paying attention, they're engaged in learning compared to the number of really high engaged learners in the control group. The difference is here, most of these more kids are shifting up here in the intervention. This is not significant because the sample size is small. Remember in Prospero I had 11,000 kids, here we have 324 kids. Okay? But we've by half reduced the number of kids that are really low in learning engagement. Okay? The significance is up here, but probably the importance may be down there. Okay? Same with attention problems. Okay? The number of kids that are high in attention problems is not changed very much, but the number of kids that are moderate attention problems is changing because more kids are showing no attention problems by their teacher's report. So we're seeing different trajectories for different outcomes, but they're all working differently in different subgroups of the population. Here's peer rejection. So in peer rejection, we're seeing it in both because there's only 2 groups. There's kids that are more likely to have peer problems, and most kids, 70% or so, don't have them. 60% in the control group. More kids that are in the intervention group are moving up into the lower rate of peer rejection. So we can look at these latent cost trajectories, and now we can use public health statistics. Okay? So now we can say, what's the relative risk of reduction between these 2 groups and, say, social competence? And what we can see is that we have a 36% reduction in kids that are at risk because of social competence, a 30% reduction in aggressive oppositional behavior, et cetera. And we can see the number of needed to treat in order to have one child now not be in that high risk group for each of these dimensions. I know I'm going through this sort of fast, but the idea is to think about the problem in a different way, not about this specific study. So these kinds of analyses are very important, because if we do this sort of the simple-minded, randomized control outcome of the whole group, it doesn't tell us much about who's really changing. We're really interested in children's trajectories, right? We're not interested in at one point in time, is the group different than the other group? We're interested in, are the trajectories of kids that begin at different starting points being differently influenced by the intervention? So this recognizes heterogeneity. It provides empirical identification for subgroups. This is a statistical modeling problem of why you should use latent class analysis. If anybody wonky that wants to talk about this later, I'd be glad to. And unlike what we call variable-centered approaches that look at variables, these don't treat small deviations as error, but rather as sources of information that can be evaluated. Okay. So I need to end in just a few minutes, don't I, Kim? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Fast Track study. Fast Track study is an enormous study. Bob McMahon, who's here at Simon Fraser, was one of my collaborators. He was at the University of Washington with me when we began this study in 1990. It's a study of very high-risk children, 445 in the intervention, 446 in the control. We took the highest crime and delinquency neighborhoods. With 6-year-olds, we took the highest risk children that were already aggressive, defiant, inattentive, et cetera. You can see they were half African American and half Caucasian, but differently distributed by the site. And 70% were boys, because that's what the demography of problems is, of those kinds. And we had a normative community sample. So we have high-risk interventions, high-risk controls, normative community sample. We intervened with them for 9 years, starting in first grade. We implemented. We looked at the outcomes and the mediators through age 25. We did a lot of interventions at school entry. Every week, parents came to the school for 22 weeks of the year. We paid them as paraprofessionals $15. We had buses that picked them up Saturday mornings. We had childcare. We had lunch. And they learned how to help support their child's early learning. Okay? We had home visitors, went to their homes. We had special social skills groups for the kids on Saturdays. And then the PATHS curriculum was used for the entire school, all the schools, all the intervention schools. Okay? So there was universal intervention with indicated kids, so it's universal and indicated, all integrated together, okay, with home visiting, et cetera. And we followed them across time. We had continuing support in the 4th to 5th grade, and then we had a middle school transition program, mentors, and helping them understand careers and taking them to beauty parlors in Tire Town to learn how different people work, et cetera. And we're actually now following them at age 29. So does Fast Track work is the big question. It was a very expensive program. It's the largest experiment of its kind in the world on the prevention of severe violence and conduct problems. And so we had modest intervention effects in elementary school. We have maybe 150 published articles on the study, but both high-risk and universal samples had effects in elementary school. All the kids in the school, in the schools that had PATHS, did better on peer relations and lower rates of aggression than all the kids in the control schools. But we had bigger effects for the high-risk kids that you would expect. The effect sizes were strongest following the initial efforts, like in 3rd, 4th grade. We had small to moderate effects that were sustained across elementary school on things like getting sent to the office and having poor peer relations and being referred for special ed. Okay? So here's the caseness. So this is the number of kids that have problems in social competence, and you can see it's larger in the control group. And the number of kids that are already showing peer deviance, the number of kids that have what we call homes community problems, and the number of kids that have problems in the school context. Does Fast Track work in middle school? We do not find any effects in middle school for the most part. Only on psychiatric interviews with the parents, we see significant reductions in conduct disorders and ADHD, but there's a black hole in middle school. There are no effects on learning or behavior of any kind. They disappeared. We thought the program had failed. Okay? And we started to go to meetings and talk about the fact that maybe it just didn't work. But in 12th grade, when we look at lifetime prevalence of serious conduct disorders, what you see is even within our high-risk group, we have a high-risk group and a sort of high-risk group. Okay? And in the high-risk group, that's where the effect is. So there's a 40% rate in the control group of serious conduct disorder in the top 3% of our kids, and we have the rate in the interventions. But there was no effect on those moderate risk kids at all, and still normative kids have lower rates than anybody else. So in adolescence, we had some reductions in conduct disorders. We had reduced use of medical services, and it turns out we had a small reduction in juvenile arrests. But we had no effects on academic achievement, GPA, retention in school, graduation, teacher-rated problems, peer relations, or substance use. So we began to declare that Fast Track was probably a failure, but we got enough money to follow them. Okay? Then a miracle occurred. Now we're age 25, and now we're looking at serious substance abuse, addiction basically, and we're seeing that the intervention group has lower rates, relative risk reduction, 20% relative risk reduction. Antisocial personality disorders. This is like the version of conduct disorders in adults. They're a serious problem, and you can see that there's a relative risk reduction of 30%. Okay? Impact on violent crimes. This is a severity weighted index of officially reported crimes that they have been arrested and tried for, and you can see that there's a significant effect on violent crimes, but there's still no effect on graduation or employment. And there are effects on depression and anxiety and also on general well-being. So what happened? Did it fade out? What faded out? When did it fade out? This is the problem of following things long enough to know. Okay? Now it turns out that actually, even though this costs $6,000 per child per year to do Fast Track, so about $50,000 per child, because these problems of severe arrest for violence, right, antisocial personality disorder, substance abuse treatment in inpatient settings is so expensive, the cost-benefit analysis looks like this easily pays for the entire intervention. Okay? But if we'd stopped it in middle school, we would have said it didn't work. Because developmental trajectories are really complicated, and we as developmentalists still know very little about them. Okay? So there's lots of ways to do things. Not one way, there's many ways to do things. We have to think about the many ways to think about the data we have and to fully explore it, to understand for whom it's working, when, and how. So where do we go from here? We have to think more productively about how to analyze the data we already have. There's lots of data, I think, already out there that we have concluded things about that we're probably wrong about. We have to think about more developmentally about how children's trajectories change across time, and we have to think about how we can use these public health models in education. Okay? And so these were just illustrations to give you an idea that we are not very far on the path. Prevention science only began as a society 15 years ago. We're all in the process of learning how to do this, and we're making enormous mistakes in our inferences about what works and doesn't work still, and we're not communicating very well our value yet to policymakers. So while I know statistics seems very wonky, many of you are not interested in the statistics themselves. You are interested in if these programs actually work and for whom, and if we don't do this well, we'll miss the boat and not affect the kind of public health changes that we're all interested in. So with that, I think I've kept them as long as we can keep them, Tim.